There we go. All right, so we're going to be talking about cellular respiration. Remember, that's the fifth process involved with respiration. It takes place inside our cells and is a form of metabolism. We've seen this slide actually before, all the way back in our, I believe, second lecture of the semester. The term metabolism is used to describe all the chemical reactions occurring in our body cells. In that same lecture, we talked about the two forms, which is catabolism and anabolism, or catabolic and anabolic reactions. Catabolism is chemical reactions, or those chemical reactions that break down complex organic molecules into simpler ones, which is what we just got done talking a heck of a lot about. Breaking things down that we've ingested into small things like amino acids, from proteins to glucose, galactose, fructose, monosaccharides, from complex carbohydrates like glycogen and polysaccharides like starches and da 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 da. Okay. Well, we're also going to talk about catabolic reactions in this lecture because they're exergonic, which means they produce more energy they consume, released in the chemical energy stored in organic molecules. So it's all about, in this lecture, the production and release of ATP. And we don't show that directly in this process, but we're going to spend the majority of our time in this lecture talking about the catabolism of glucose. Glucose, a 6-carbon monosaccharide, has a lot of energy in it that when we go through hydrolysis, a type of chemical reaction, not only breaks down the complex compounds, but releases the useful energy from it. Okay. So we'll talk a lot about breaking bonds, producing smaller molecules, but most importantly, the release of useful energy. We do that so that we can then perform anabolic reactions, which is where we combine simple molecules and monomers to form our body's complex structural and functional components. And these are endergonic, meaning they consume more energy than they produce, which is the energy in the form of ATP that we just formed in the catabolic reactions. Now, ATP can be formed by cells 3 different ways: substrate level phosphorylation, oxidative phosphorylation, and photophosphorylation. Humans can only do 2 out of those 3 things. Any idea which of those forms of phosphorylation we cannot do? It's the last one. Photophosphorylation is production of energy from the process known as photosynthesis, something that plants and algae can do, where they take sunlight and make energy from that. Okay. In the case of anabolic reactions, it's dehydration synthesis. So we remove water as we fuse smaller subunits together to get something bigger. So I kind of already described this, but those anabolic and catabolic reactions go together, and we can say that as a result, they're coupled to one another. When complex molecules are broken down by catabolic reactions, some of the energy from their many bonds is transferred to form ATP. We show that right here, and we form the ATP going from here to here, complex to simple. Okay. What's also going to be formed is another form of heat, or another form of energy, and that's in the form of heat. We also produce heat when we go through anabolic reactions, where we're going from simple to complex, which requires ATP that we form back in our catabolic reactions. Okay. And actually, it's a very significant amount of heat that's given off, around 60%. So over half of the energy that we form is given off as heat. Now, that's not necessarily wasteful energy, because as you know, we're warm-blooded animals. So that heat that our body has to maintain this high body temperature comes from those processes. So catabolic and anabolic reactions are coupled to one another, but so are oxidation and reduction reactions. And those are very important aspects of energy transport, or energy transfer, and therefore mechanisms of ATP production. Okay. Oxidation is a loss of electrons during a redox. Redox is just short for reduction oxidation. It's just combining the words. And this is what we do to C6H12O6, which is the chemical formula for glucose. We essentially strip it of a lot of its electrons, not all of them, but many of them, to the point where we're left with carbon dioxide, CO2. And that's the carbon dioxide that we then have to exhale, as we've been talking here lately. And in this process of oxidation, it causes a decrease in potential energy of that atom or molecule. So we essentially steal a lot of the energy from glucose. And that energy's got to go somewhere. That's where this is formed. Okay? And taking in the electrons, and actually we snatch a lot of the hydrogens. In fact, we snatch all the hydrogens because those essentially go together. Usually involves lots of hydrogen atoms. Okay? We end up with carbon dioxide, but more importantly, what we are able to gain at all this is energy in the form of ATP. Okay? Now, in order to oxidize something, we have two very important molecules known as coenzymes. Okay? These are going to allow the liberated hydrogen atoms from the oxidation reactions to be transferred to something else. They are NAD plus and FAD, short for something much more complicated. I don't ever care about you knowing their real names. NAD we derive from the B vitamin niacin, whereas FAD comes from the vitamin B12 riboflavin. Okay. Well, these guys, if you want to think of them, they are electron carriers. If you want to, I always just think about the relationships in my family growing up. I was one of four, and I was third in line. So I had two older siblings, and I had a younger sibling. So I had the benefit of being a big brother and a little brother. Okay. Well, when I was a freshman in high school, my brother was a senior, and he drove me to school when he wasn't being a butthead, when I was the nicest big brother. Okay. But in our relationship, his car was like NAD and FAD. It was our transporter. Okay. He was like an electron. He always got to ride in his car. Okay. Some days my brother would be a butthead and he'd leave me, so my mom or dad would have to take me to school. Okay. I, being the little brother, was like hydrogen ions. Okay. Hydrogens, like the ones here in glucose, get to come along, but sometimes, like here we see, this hydrogen is not directly attached to the NADH molecule. Okay. We go from NAD, which is like an empty vehicle, to NADH, which has the electrons and one of the hydrogens. And then the other hydrogen, it's almost like it's riding in the trunk. It's something my brother never made me do, thankfully. Okay. Well, in this form of NADH plus H plus, or sometimes you'll see it just listed as NADH2, because this one's here, but it's not directly connected. This is described as being what we call a reduced coenzyme. A reduced coenzyme means that it's been reduced, it has gone through a reduction. And a reduction is the opposite of oxidation, where it's accepted electrons or it's gained electrons. So these electrons that are taken from glucose get accepted, get picked up by NAD as well as FAD, which means they go from oxidized states where they're lacking those electrons to FADH2 and NADH plus H plus, which is their reduced form, where they've gained the electrons. Now, their job is just to get the electrons and the hydrogens from point A to point B. They take those electrons and hydrogens, and they're going to give them to oxygen, and that's what forms this water here. And so we say that oxygen becomes reduced because that's where the electrons end up going. Oxygen accepts those electrons. It also accepts the hydrogens. And so that's why we say oxygen becomes reduced, forming water. Now, a reduction increases the potential energy of that molecule because the electrons in there have a lot of pent up energy. When we oxidize, we lose or decrease potential energy because we're taking away those electrons and hydrogens. Whereas when we oxidize or when we reduce, that gains the potential energy. Okay. And that's what I'm going to describe here on this page. Okay. So when we go from NAD plus to NADH plus H plus, it's being reduced because it's gaining electrons and the hydrogens. Okay. So in this state, we'd call it a reduced coenzyme. Same thing over here for FADH2. Okay. So when an NAD plus is reduced to NADH plus H plus, or NADH2 as you sometimes see it listed, NAD plus gains a hydride ion, which reduces or neutralizes its charge, which is why it goes NAD plus to a no or neutral charge, NADH. Okay. The other hydrogen ion is released in the surrounding solution. It's just basically right there, but it's not directly connected. Now, these reactions, they could have an arrow going in the opposite direction from this direction over here to this direction, because they are reversible. Okay. Just like a car can pick up a person, they can also kick a person out, right? Okay. So like my brother and me riding to school, we like the electrons and the hydrogens. And then when we got to school, we got out of his car to go inside. Okay. That's what NAD is, an empty car. NADH plus H plus is a car that's full. Okay. Same thing for FAD and FADH2. In the case of FADH2, both hydrogens are directly connected when it is reduced. Okay. It gains both a hydrogen ion and a hydride ion. And so both the hydrogens are attached, whereas in NADH plus H plus, that second hydrogen is just right there. Like I said, kind of like riding in the trunk. Now, once again, just like I said, you can go this direction from FAD to FADH2, but you can also go in this direction, which means we'd see an oxidation occurring in that case because it's lost the electrons and the hydrogens. This is going to be what we're going to see a lot of as we run through glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. All the different components of cellular respiration. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop here because we're out of time. We'll start with this slide, which will kind of wrap things up on oxidation reduction, and then we'll really start getting into the fun next week.